Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Welcome. My name is Harry Cortopina. I'm Executive Director here at IPPR, and I'm delighted to see so many people here, an absolutely packed room for this conversation. And I'm not at all surprised, because it is probably one of the biggest debates confronting this new Labour government, which is we have the lowest investment in the G7, and Rachel Reeves has promised to deliver the highest growth in the G7. It doesn't take a PhD in economics to work out that those two things do not go together. And so the challenge and the question is, how should Labour approach the question of investment? How do we create room for the investments we need, both to drive growth, decarbonisation, and to ensure that our public realm has the infrastructure we need? I am absolutely delighted to be convening such an impressive panel to talk about this conversation. We're still waiting on Torsten, who will be joining us momentarily, but we're going to kick off so we get as maximum time for questions and debate as possible. So I'm going to start by asking Carsten Young in my team to just set the scene a little bit on the investment challenge, and to talk a bit about some of the things that Labour should be considering in trying to get investment up. So over to you, Carsten.
Thanks, Harry. So this is, of course, quite a big debate, so trying to bring some structure to it with my opening remarks. So at IPPR, we've done some work on investment needs across the economy. The Committee for Climate Change has estimated we need about 50–60 billion annual investment just to hit our net zero target. We did some analysis that was very bottom up. We found about 30 billion per year is needed. A lot of it in transport, in housing, but also in industry, nature and energy, to deliver our net zero targets, but also to get growth up in the medium term. Zooming out from just public investment to also include private investment, if you take all of the economy-wide investment, the UK has been at the bottom of the G7 of advanced economies of the ranking for 24 out of the last 30 years. We've just never really been able to leave this rock bottom level. So it's not just low government investment, which has been below G7 average, it's also business investments, and the two are very much intertwined. So the question is, how do we unlock more investment? So the way I see it is there's sort of three bottlenecks that are all intertwined, and I hope we get to talk a little bit about all of them, but mostly looking at sort of the macro angle to this, like how can we, from a macroeconomic point of view, think of this in a different way. So first of all, we need to make sure that we have the space, the fiscal space, to do public investment that then unlocks private investment. So at the moment, we have a fiscal rule that caps the debt level between year 4 and 5 in the forecast horizon, and so it can go up in that period. And for some types of public investments, that will make it difficult to invest them because their return will be further out. So there's a question around how can we make public investments fit within a fiscal framework. Secondly, we can't just use public fiscal space to invest in anything. The second thing is we need to make sure these are good investments, these are high return investments. And one of the big problems is that until very recently, institutions like the OBR, who scores the homework of the government in terms of investment, they have assumed that the returns to that investment will be very low. And so basically, you just borrow to invest, but you don't get any return. And we need to make, and I hope we get into this, we need to be much more nuanced in terms of which investments are good investments for growth and which ones aren't so good. And finally, we need sort of the non-fiscal side of this is planning reform and how costly it is to build in the UK. So for example, building a mile of railway line in the UK is about twice as expensive as it is in the rest of the world. and various other categories, building energy infrastructure as well, we're a multiple higher than in other countries. It also takes much longer here to build stuff. So the third pillar we really need to address is how do we reform our frameworks and our building ecosystem in order to make investment cheaper. And I think these are sort of the three aspects. So space to invest, good investments, and making it cheaper.
Thank you, Carsten. Really set the terms of the debate very well. I'm going to come to you next, Heather. A lot of that will sound familiar, I think, to some of the challenges you've been facing in the US. Can you tell us a bit about what you've done to unlock greater investment and what advice you have to Torsten and others in the Labour Party who are trying to do that now here?
Oh, I can. So I am going to only speak about what we've done in the United States, and you can take or leave any of these lessons that are, helpful. I know we're a continent-spanning economy. We're a little bit bigger, but I think these will apply. So when the president came into office, he had a big vision to invest in America. And he passed 3 pieces of legislation: the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the CHIPS and Science Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, these 3 laws were designed together, and they are being implemented together. And 2 of them, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and CHIPS and Science Act, were passed on a bipartisan basis, which in the US context is very important. The IRA was purely on partisan grounds. And the crux of this was that we need to be making foundational investments in infrastructure, long delayed. I can't tell you how many times I testified in front of the US Congress where I said yet again and again that we were getting a D on infrastructure, that we just were, bridges were falling down, all sorts of long unmet needs, still lead pipes out there, poisoning water for when no level of lead is healthy for children and all the likes. So we had that set of investments. And then these capacity expanding, productivity enhancing investments in sectors that we believe will be important for now and looking into the future for American competitiveness, for national and economic security. And those were about semiconductors and making sure that we were diversifying the semiconductor supply chain, and about clean energy, first and foremost, right? And we are investing in 37 different clean energy technologies. Okay, so that's the what are we doing? And I just listened to Chancellor Reeves's speech, and she used this phrase that we've also been using a lot in the United States, which is that what we make, and we put in America, but what we make in America and how we make it matters. That our economic strategy is thinking first and foremost about the composition of what kinds of industries we have. We need to, again, diversify our semiconductor supply chain. We invented them in America. We need to be able to make them here. This is really important for economic security. And then clean energy, we all know that we need to move to build a clean energy economy. The only way we can reach our climate goals is to start meeting some of those investment goals globally. And actually, one question for you, Carsten, is whether or not that $30 billion was all public or private. You can answer that, when you get a chance. But my understanding is that we need to make $3 to $6 trillion worth of investment globally each year in building out these technologies, and we are nowhere near that yet. And that most of that money, 70%, is private. So how do we induce that private sector investment? Building infrastructure, and we've picked industries that we think are important. We're setting that direction, setting the goal, if you will. And once we've done that, the policies we put in place were designed to crowd in private capital to those sectors. Now, as an economist, if there's any of you in the room, we can hash it out about crowding in versus crowding out, but nothing could be more important to the planet, and I would argue to America's future and the future of good jobs in the United States than we build out a clean energy economy. So crowding in those investments into clean energy through a variety of means, through the innovation to commercialization pipeline, all across that spectrum, including tax cuts, tax credits for businesses who want to make investment in clean energy or to produce clean energy. And in each of those ways that we sought to crowd in that private capital, finding ways to nudge or to push or strongly encourage those businesses to, as they are making those investments, create good jobs. So you get a bigger tax credit for your clean energy investment if you invest in a low-income community, if you invest in a fossil fuel community, if you invest and you use what we call prevailing wages, which are good job wages, and if you use registered apprenticeships. So building in the good jobs outcome that we ultimately want to see, because that is our ultimate goal, but saying we only get that through what we make in our country and how we make it, that how being just as important as the what. So If you will indulge me, just 2 stats, maybe 3. Success. So on the success, we have seen, I mean, I am often, I mean, I talk on this every single day, and I'm still a little blown away by what we've done. So far, private firms have announced $910 billion of investment. That's announcements in newspapers and press releases, whatever, all across the country. Disproportionately, those investments are going to communities where people are less likely than the overall average in America to have a college degree, and disproportionately where those communities are, their incomes are less than the national average. So they're going to the communities that need that investment the most. So catching up with that goal, right? And while we're doing all the things to support unions and all the other stuff. So we are seeing those investments being announced. That announcement has been followed up by, if I were to show you the chart of investment in the construction of new manufacturing facilities in the United States, it'd be bing, all the way up, more than doubled over this period. And not just a 1 quarter more than doubling, 6 quarters of historic investment in the construction of new manufacturing facilities. 6 quarters, 3 of those, the largest quarter going back to 1956 when we started tabulating that data. So as a share of GDP, we are doing more to invest private dollars into these clean energy and semiconductors than we've made in any investment in manufacturing probably since the end of World War II, although we don't have the data, so I can't say that for sure, but I'm just gonna go out on a limb and say probably. So we're creating good jobs, we're making investment, and these are private sector investments, and doing that through using the power of the public purse. And so I wanted just one thing that you said, Karsten, about making it cheaper. Our economics is based on 3 foundational principles. 1, make sure that that it's first and foremost about workers, families, communities. First and foremost about creating good jobs. But we do that through what we make and how we make it. But second, and these are the 3 points laid out in the president's economic speech, but the same vision we've had for years now. Second is making sure that competition is fair, both domestically and internationally. You have to make it possible for these new industries to succeed, and that comes from having a fair and level playing field, whatever that means for that industry. So thinking about antitrust, thinking about fair trade, thinking about making sure that it is fair, and that is the way that you get the prices to come down. You make those investments, you have that infant industry, you have the learning by doing, those prices will come down, and if you are focused on competition, but fair competition, and then third is making these investments all across America. So boom, that's what we've done. I encourage you to, I'm happy to answer questions after this, but I think that there's a lot to be learned from thinking about this in a new way and really front-loading the kind of economy we want to see, building on the work that folks like Mariani have done to really make us what I think of, I know you talk about missions, but goal-oriented economics, right? Where we know the kind of world we want to create and using all of the power of the tools that we have to get there.
Thank you, Heather, and thank you for coming to join us here in the UK. We're really, really pleased to have you. I'm going to come to you next, Torsten, because having turned up late, I think you have to leave early as well. In classic.
Do I?
That's what I've been told.
Right.
I mean,
awkwardly, I'm going to look at my diary while the others are talking. Work out what I'm leaving early too. But thanks for rubbing it in. This is quite a tough audience.
I know.
Because that lady, or my friend Heather, just told you that a centre-left government started turning things around in the United States, and you get to clap for that, you tough buggers. Come on. What do you want? It's been a gloomy decade. Biden winning is quite a big deal. Obviously, I'm totally neutral on what happens in a few weeks' time, and the Labour Party and government will work with whoever is elected across the whole time. Right, look, who listened to Rachel's speech earlier? Hands up. What were the rest of you doing? Absolutely no loyalty whatsoever. You should have listened to it, okay? If you didn't listen to it, here's the highlights. We're going to start investing in our future again.
Yes.
Britain's going to stop being a country that's living off its past, and it's going to start investing in its future again. Why are we going to do that? 1, because we have been living off our past for quite some time. Most of our sewage system goes back 100 years. How many reservoirs have we built since 1992? 0. How much has the population gone up since 1992? 10 million people. Yep, that's why your water system is collapsing. So we're going to invest for that reason. We're going to invest also because this Labour government has specific goals that happen to be high investment goals. Net zero, in simplistic terms, is one massive investor-save project. really big investments needed up front. On the technology side, yes, but actually just on stripping out a carbon-intensive infrastructure and replacing it one that lets us run our economy in lots of ways cheaper, but most importantly, not dependent on carbon. That is an investment project. Anyone that says you can do that without that investment is just not paying any attention to the economics. And secondly, for the UK specifically, although there's elements of this in the US, whatever you want to call levelling up, we need to do that, and that also is capital intensive in what it requires. If you think you're going to see any substantive change to our economic geography without big investments, particularly in some of our larger cities, I wouldn't mind some in some of the smaller cities. In Swansea, we would also like a metro as well, but that is an investment-led project. Third reason it needs to be a high investment period is that we're fed up of being poor. Like, why does Britain have lower productivity than France? Almost all of it can be explained by a smaller capital stock. And even if you're kind of, a proper anti-capitalist, although you lot look quite smartly dressed, so they haven't been invited here, obviously. But you might like an NHS that is vaguely functioning, okay? And being richer means an NHS with, everyone keeps saying, I can't believe the productivity in the NHS hasn't gone up. Well, they haven't visited the NHS recently. If you put more workers into dilapidated buildings without any more capital equipment, and you want to know why productivity in the NHS hasn't risen, that is why, okay? And we've been switching capital spend in the NHS into paying for people's salaries for the last 10 years, so it shouldn't be a surprise we are where we are. So for all those reasons, we need to invest. The government is doing that, is now taking steps to try to make sure we move into that high investment phase. What is the first thing we are doing? Not being Liz Truss. And I know it's unfashionable because everyone says, oh, it didn't make any difference, how bad can it be? It can be really bad, people. Like, I don't just mean like Liz Truss is bad, she is, but chaotic, destabilised governments are bad things. And the British press will at some point wake up to the fact that there is a government run by two very stable people with an absolute majority, and the news is not, is there a tiny rebellion here or there, we're going to be winning all the votes. The news is the hard policy asks of getting on and changing this country, and at some point, that is what we should be talking about, and that is what will actually matter over the next 10 years. Then on energy, Ed Miliband is speaking in about 5 seconds. Who has been watching his TikTok? The guy, what's the line from Hamilton? He writes non-stop. Well, Ed Miliband is like legislating doing non-stop, right? In Wales, we never banned onshore wind, but in England, we managed to ban one of the cheapest forms of electricity generation due to being off our rockers. And a Labour government has turned up and is making sure that we can do that again. Solar farms being allowed to go. Anyone here self-identifying as a Green Party member? Who's brave? Put your hands up. You're ludicrous people. Why are you ludicrous people? Because you say you want to save the planet, and then bloody Green candidates in every part of this country are opposing the building that is required to deliver that net zero transition. If you are anti things being built, then you are pro the current infrastructure, high carbon, and you should sod right off. Right. Thirdly, what are we doing? Planning. If you want stuff done, if you want to be a high investment country, you have to build things. And you have to do that, one, because the investment often is building. Have you met a data center? But even if you live in a completely intangible world, that kind of investment, it has to happen usually in a building of some kind. Yeah? Forget the culture wars about how much you're working at home, how much you're working in the office. There will still be some buildings, people. And if we don't build anything, which is what Britain's current growth plan appears to have been for the last 15 years, you won't get that investment happening. Now, things to ponder, because I haven't quite got used to being a politician. So here's some trade-offs and things to think about why this is not totally straightforward. The first thing, because it's easy for us to say we want lots more investment and then to be like, yeah, go and do it, but then not get into what it means. So first thing is, not all investments are the same and equal. And it's easy. I hear regularly people on the radio and things saying, oh, we should just definitely invest in this. It will definitely all pay for itself. Don't worry about where the financing comes from. It's rubbish, right? Some investments are like absolute gangbusters that we want to do. They will pay for themselves. Happy days. Those are the easy ones. Some won't, okay? Like the capital investment required to sort out lots of our housing stock so that our heating systems can be decarbonised won't deliver an economic return. It won't pay for itself. It's just really important we do it. And if you don't start wrestling with those things, then you belong in opposition, not in government, because things are hard sometimes. Pay some attention to them. Secondly, where do the resources come from? And I don't mean capital, right? Wander around the conference at the moment and people one after another will come up to you and say, we've got a wave of capital ready to invest. Why doesn't Britain do it? That's not the interesting thing. Okay, yes, there's money available, you can find money. The interesting thing is, where did the resources, the actual resources, people, kit, come from to deliver those investments? Because if we're putting things into investment, more people, let's make it really simple. If you want a larger construction sector because you're doing more investment, people will be working, fewer people will be working in other sectors. The structure of your economy will shift. That's the macro side of it, right? And you need to pay attention to that because resources do have to come from somewhere, and that's particularly important when you're in the stage of the economic cycle we are in now. It's also worth thinking about on the micro of that. Because again, if everyone just says, oh, investment's really good, you don't deal with the trade-offs. Here's a really concrete one. Water investments, okay? Because of our privatized water system, every investment we make, the reason why we have a heavily regulated sector but it's privatized is because it's privatized, right? Because we're basically setting the price that everyone pays for their water on the basis of what the private sector is allowed to invest, right? So we should care about the price, right? We care about how much people, particularly poor households, have to pay for their water. So this is not free money. We need to think about the micro and the macro of where the resources come from to deliver us this high economy future. And then lastly, just to wrap up, which is like I spent most of my life working on the economics side of this, but this in high investment decade is about the politics. And it's about the politics because every day I'm out door knocking in Swansea, okay, talking to people about why they didn't vote in the last election, which was a lot of people in Swansea. And some of this is like basic. Their faith in a system that cannot even fill in the holes in their roads is broken. And so even if you don't believe that we need a high investment decade because the economic returns are necessary, we have got to do it. Because if you don't, people are going to lose their faith that a system can deliver, and that is when we get really bad, not just economic outcomes, but political outcomes. So that's what we're going to do, and that's what we've got to do. I'm looking forward to seeing you all do it. Okay.
Thank you, Torsten. Mariana, I'm going to come to you next. You obviously have spent a lot of your career championing the idea of missions and mission-driven government, and we've now got a government that's at least talking about mission-driven government. How can mission-driven government help solve the investment challenge, the growth challenge, the productivity challenge we have in this country?
So you say tomato, I say tomato, you say goals, I say missions. I actually think words matter, and I know you do too. Actually, Heather and I have a funny story. Should we quickly tell them?
Go for it.
We were doing our PhD together, and on the side, we were doing some research work for a trade union called Unite. Actually, it was called Act 2, it became Unite. And they gave us a research project, and they gave her industrial strategy stuff, like technology, and they gave me care. And I care about care, but I don't want to do care. She don't want to do industrial strategy. So we went, I think, to Central Park. He said, quietly, let's just swap. And I don't think we even ever told them, but it ended up becoming my PhD, her PhD, because of this swap. Anyway, so it's great to be with Heather. I do think words matter because if we just say goals, there's many goals. Growth is a goal, productivity is a goal, jobs are a goal. My view is that the concept of missions, at least, and I don't want to be pedantic here, but a bit, and I'm allowed to, being a professor, you're allowed to be boring and pedantic, but missions, if you take them seriously, it immediately, for example, requires changing completely how we do industrial strategy. And a lot of what we're talking about here, whether we use the word or not, is industrial strategy. In a country where private sector investment is the lowest in the G7, 28th in the OECD, as we heard before, we need more private sector investment. But you don't want private sector investment by just making a list of random sectors. And in this country, we had a list of 5. I don't know how I always remember, because I don't remember literally what I did yesterday, but it was automotive, aerospace, finance, life sciences, and the creative industry. Literally, I have no idea how I remember that. So that's a random list of sectors, right? There's lots of other sectors. And sometimes when you have these lists globally, they are literally sectors that have been able to lobby their way up and be considered a priority sector, right? So the life sciences. It's very different to talk about why we need life sciences and the pharmaceutical industry and the biotech industry if we have health-related goals, which then that sector, but many other ones, have to actually invest and transform. When we have industrial strategies that just have these top sectors, the strategy itself can get captured. And in fact, a lot of regressive tax policies, because we don't just have corporate income tax, capital gains tax, we have all sorts of tax policies. Many of the ones that have simply increased profits and not investment, there's no profits problem, by the way, in the UK, there's an investment problem, have in fact been lobbied for with certain stories that these sectors or certain types of actors told. So it's really important, I think, to focus on missions that have to do, obviously, with net zero, biggest crisis of our time, but also health, the digital divide. I was just in Brazil. Biodiversity is a very big issue. Also here, water. I'm on the Global Commission on the Economics of Water. Water should be treated as a global common good. The global hydrological cycle unites us. We can't have water nationalism like we couldn't have vaccine nationalism. So missions, the idea of missions is for them, first of all, to be decided locally, regionally, or nationally. You definitely don't need a panel to tell a country what its missions are, but they should be designed in such a way that really then require, by design, intersectoral investment. The reason I wrote Mission Economy is I don't think we would go to the moon today if we did policy like we do. You know, the moon landing was not just about aerospace. It required so many different sectors, thinking about, you know, what would the astronauts wear, how would they move, how would they go to the bathroom, how would they eat. And it was because NASA really cared. That's the other thing, urgency. Do we care about the problems we talk about? They immediately started to change the tools they had to be truly mission-oriented or outcomes-oriented. So first thing, procurement. They moved procurement away from just being cost-plus procurement, which doesn't foster innovation. It's literally just a handout between two parties, towards outcomes-oriented procurement to solve the hundreds of homework problems that needed to be solved to get to the moon and back. Solutions to those problems, you all know them: camera phones, folio blankets, baby formula, so on and so forth. So by using and taking seriously all the tools that governments have, from procurement to grants, loans, subsidies, not to just be handouts, you know, to a sector or a type of firm, an SME, just because you're small, right? So picking winners, technology, sectors, types of firms, towards picking the willing, and if you're small, you get more support because you're small, that will help move an economy in a certain direction. But that requires confidence, because it means the contracts, whether it's a procurement contract or a public loan contract, needs to be a good deal. And the examples you give are really important. In the CHIPS Act, we actually, as you know, had a bit of, through my institute, we at least help the conversation move forwards in the US around how to build in conditionality, because that's what it is. We can use any sort of words we want, but it was actually conditionality that how much was it, 450 billion?
It's 58 billion for the fabs.
Yeah, but the whole thing with the grants, wasn't it 450 billion? CHIPS.
Inflation reduction was 370 billion, and it was 58 billion it's 58 billion for the
chips, for the semiconductor. But then there was also the grants.
Yeah, that is the grants. Yes. Keep going.
Okay, anyway, so in the CHIPS Act, they put in conditionality that those semiconductor companies that were benefiting from that act had to have different types of investments that you mentioned, improving working conditions, energy efficient supply chains, but also fundamentally reinvesting profits that are generated back into the productive system. So this ultra financialization that we've had globally, in the UK and the US are really kind of on the front lines of that. What does that mean? It means that when profits are then generated from all these great policies that we're advocating for, let's make sure that they're actually reinvested back in instead of extracted out through just dividend payouts and share buybacks. 7 trillion is the number, trillion, 12 zeros, that's been used by the top 500 companies in the world just to buy back their shares in the last 10 years. So buying back shares to boost stock prices, stock options, and executive pay. Some share buybacks are fine. This is an excess use of share buybacks. So I do think that there's something about also talking, you know, we're not psychiatrists here, but a bit of therapy, which is the confidence in the room does matter. Mm-hmm. And the willingness and ability, sometimes you also need legal experts that help you do that. And just 3 really quick examples of how we don't do that here. During COVID, many companies weren't able to produce, because we were all locked down, and so they needed loans. EasyJet, one of our airlines, was one of them. They got 600 million, no conditions attached. Mm-hmm. Same type of companies in France. France is definitely not perfect, but there is much more confidence in the government how it works with businesses. Renault and Air France had to commit to reducing their carbon emissions, which means investment innovation, training, so on and so forth, in order to get 1 penny out of the COVID schemes. Second, steel. Steel in this country constantly in trouble, asking to be bailed out. Okay, they might need to be helped, but not just to survive, be helped to transform. In Germany, the public bank, and this is very important because we're setting up new public funds here, like wealth funds and other such outfits. In Germany, the loans that have been made to the steel sector have been conditional on that sector transforming itself. How do you transform? Through investment. Transformation where? To lower the material content of production throughout the whole supply chain. Why do we have green steel in Germany? Because of that. Not because they went to Davos or to talk about purpose and becoming a better company. They had to get 1 euro out. And I already mentioned the CHIPS Act. So really taking care to make sure that this moment of renewal of investment is also a moment for a new social contract between public and private, but also between public and citizenry. I completely agree with what you're saying. One of the countries I'm from Italy, but have 3 citizenships, but Italy has just gone through a huge populist wave. The risk in the US, people aren't stupid. It's not that they're stupid, hence they're voting for Trump or a particular very right-wing xenophobic government. They have been left behind, and unfortunately when things go bad, some parties then simply like to blame either the immigrants or whether it's putting up walls on the Mexico border or Brexit and so on. So if we don't solve, and I completely agree with you, that problem of trust, everything else won't happen because you get many kind of civil wars. And what I've really learned from in working with Camden, we were on this stage yesterday talking about some local work that my institute has done, is that itself requires care. It's not just about doing a consultation process. Really involving, when possible, with some of these missions, people's voices and bringing them not only to your table, but the policymakers and the businesses going to other people's tables to listen and to involve them from the start, including in ownership issues. Yesterday we talked about the role of food cooperatives in Camden. It's not just food banks, but green food cooperatives. The expression of a person walking into a food bank is completely different from their expression walking into a food cooperative where they have ownership, dignity, self-worth. And so I think that's the other really important point, which is, yes, Trump's policy is totally successful, especially in Trump voting states, but why didn't they land as much in terms of the narrative and the storytelling and the way that people kind of give credit in some ways, not just reading an economics paper, right? But actually the degree to which that itself maybe for the next administration, Democratic administration, perhaps can be done with as much attention. And I don't think, by the way, economists are experts on this. This is where we really need to speak more, even to the cultural industry and to others who, documentary makers who, by design, have to be listening when they're working with others. I don't think we've been listening very much, and when we don't listen, we lose trust.
Thank you, Mariana. Last but by no means least, I'm going to come to you, Simon, and thanks very much to KPMG for supporting this event. You obviously lead the energy, natural resources element of KPMG, but have worked in government for a long time. So I'd be really interested in your take on how we get investment up, both public, of course, but also private.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yes, 25 years of doing it from the government side and now 10 years advising clients on the private side. 3 points to just build on what's been said earlier. Firstly, just to pick up on what Carsten said about the scale of the investment we're going to need. It's 1.4 trillion when you add all those annual amounts up to 2050 that we need. And so the scale of that means the vast majority of this is going to come from private sector investment, certainly in the energy sector, in other sectors, maybe slightly less in transport, a lot more public spending in transport, but the vast majority of this investment is going to come from the private sector. So the funds the government does have, things like the National Wealth Fund, remember we've got 7 billion going in there, we've got 8 billion going into GB Energy, really have to be used to catalyse private sector investment. And so where I would challenge some of the things that have been said is about investing in mature technologies. With limited funds, I think we need to be focusing on catalysing the new technologies that are riskier and can get the cost down of those new technologies we're going to need for net zero. So I do think there's something about how we use the funds the government does. Sadly, Heather, we don't have 370 billion of tax credits available. I hear 22 billion of the black holes being filled in the conference hall next door. So we don't have that scale of fiscal firepower, and I'm assuming that an economy-wide carbon tax, which most economists would agree would be a good thing, is out of reach. So therefore, the UK's got to be even smarter on regulation and in giving clear regulatory signals. Now, we've got some of them. I mean, I would commend the fact that we've got a very clear 2030 clean power mission for our power sector. That's very clear. For the ban on petrol and diesel car sales gives a good signal for the automotive industry, but there are huge swathes of the economy where we don't quite yet have that clarity of that long-term regulatory signal. So, when I was in government and trying to drive renewable energy, it was all about providing that clarity of a long-term to get international investors to come here to the UK and invest. We can evolve those frameworks, as Heather said, to make it matter how it gets done. And you can evolve those frameworks to actually generate more jobs and investment here in the UK. I think that's entirely possible, and we should be looking to do that. But I come back to my central point, which is we are going to need to attract global investors here to the UK if we're going to achieve the net zero mission. Thanks. Thank you, Simon.
Great, I'm now going to come to the audience for questions. Do we have a microphone somewhere? Great. So if you want to put your hand up, say who you are, questions rather than statements would be great. Who would like to ask a question? I've got the lady at the back there.
Hello, Hannah Beaker from the New Economics Foundation. Thank you for the presentations and thank you for the emphasis also on explicit conditionalities, which right now, though there's been talk in Rachel's speech about moving towards industrial strategy, and that certainly seems to be something that's coming sooner rather than later. Not much has been said around explicit conditionalities that might be placed on those investments. Any thoughts from the panel on what we can expect and whether treating the New Deal as separate from our industrial strategy loses an opportunity actually to make those conditions explicit?
Okay, the gentleman on the left over here.
Thanks very much. I'm Tom Railton from the Invest in Britain campaign. So I think what we're talking about here, especially on the public investment side, is often a switch from short-termism to long-term thinking. The OBR put out a paper a few weeks ago showing that public investment really does generate big fiscal returns for the government, but not within 5 years. In fact, 5 years is actually one of the worst points at which to measure the impact that public investment is having. So the question is, can we have a shift to long-term thinking on the public investment side while we have a set of fiscal rules that lock us into short-term thinking?
And I'll take a couple more, if we have them. Gentleman just down here.
Thanks. I wanted to ask about the space between where universities and private investment usually work, so early tech readiness level versus late tech readiness level. It's that middle part that I'm from the University of Nottingham. We see that middle part, the mid-tech readiness level, a hard place to find investment for, which matters if you're trying to take early tech like decarbonizing airplanes to market-ready technology. So I'm wondering if folks have ideas on what the solution is. Is it a public-private blend of some type? How do you bring an investment to that research gap?
Okay. Anybody else want to come in at this point? The gentleman at the back and then the lady at the back just here.
Hello, I'm Michael Rubenstein. I'm a councillor in Bury in Greater Manchester. I want to go on the super macro level. A few weeks ago, I got on the tram in Bury. At the same time, I was reading how a station at one of the new lines in London had just won an architectural award. And I sat on the train waiting for it to go 10 minutes late. When I go to London, it's like I'm going to another country. And this has been the difference in investment in London, the south, compared to the rest of the country has been going on for decades. So I suppose my question is, actually, before the question, it's the biggest factor we have is, we keep hearing, is productivity. And I wonder how we can expect to get productivity raised in the north to levels close to London when the north is so badly invested in. Thank you.
Thank you. And then the lady, if you just raise your hand again. Yeah, great. Just behind you over here, Keir.
Thank you very much. Councillor Victoria Kintombi-Akwamde, councillor in Dartford. You mentioned the importance of planning interest in your conversation earlier, and just focusing on the Lower Thames crossing and the fact that it's currently going through that development consent process, and we all know that that process often takes way too long than is required. Does that mean then the government would perhaps quicken and make that process of getting consent for massive infrastructure projects a lot quicker so that then we can actually invest in our infrastructures?
Thank you. So just a reminder to the panel, we've got conditionality on state investment, we've got the time frame for the return on investment, we've got investing in some of the tricky kind of from research to commercialization pathway, regional inequality in investment, and planning. Torsten, are you going to leave, or are you staying for the whole thing?
This is so good.
Okay, great. I thought so.
Except that these buggers still won't clap.
I thought so. Now our efforts check you out. You can join IPPR. So we don't need to go to Carsten first. We go to Torsten first because he's staying. Carsten, do you want to kick off?
Confused.
You can wait your turn.
Okay.
Sure. I think let me weave these together a little bit with a not too long answer. So on the question on the returns to investment that Tom mentioned, that the OBR, as I said earlier, previously said, well, if you borrow to invest, you won't really get much return out of it. And so it didn't really work with the fiscal rules we currently have. That's one of the reasons why we probably underinvested on the state side. They've now come out, and this is quite significant, sounds arcane, but is quite important. They've now said, actually, we reassessed the evidence, and there is a higher return to investment. So it actually gives some more leeway within the fiscal rules that the government has announced to borrow to invest a little bit more. But I wanted to weave this back to what Heather said. There is still more to learn in this space. So most observers were really surprised, and I think Heather herself as well, actually, like how big the short-term returns were in terms of crowding and private investment from the IRA. And this isn't yet fully reflected in some of the assumptions that organizations like the OBR make. Another example is EV subsidies in China. So they hugely grew their electric vehicle industry with about $30 billion, which is actually not that much. I was quite amazed. Between 2009 and 2022, they've soared to be not just the biggest producer of electric vehicles, but also the biggest purchasers. They have about 8 million annual purchases, which is, I think, 8 times what the US has. So there is something around public investment that has returns, or public spending that has returns, needn't just be building roads and bridges, but it can also be supporting industries and generating the demand that will end up fueling further supply upgrades. So I think there's a lot more to be done on thinking about the returns to investment. I agree that the 5-year target really misses a lot of things that will have high returns in the long term, but still, even within the 5 years, I think the IRA really taught us that there is more there. And government should have the ability to bet on those returns rather than just being bound by estimates that were estimated based on some past events that don't really apply for the types of strategic investments that this government is planning to make.
Heather.
Comments that'll weave in together a number of the answers, and I'm glad you noted that, Carsten, because one of the things I wanted to add to that is you need to be very, very careful about the assumptions in your models. You need to dig into that more because in a lot of cases, so here's the thing, just to focus on clean energy. We've never lived through anything like this before at the speed and scale that we need to do. And the idea that modelers, these magical people in rooms somewhere that have data that is always, by definition, backward looking, with models that are, by definition, based on prevailing relationships for a massive global transformation in how we power everything, the idea that our models would actually be able to give us the exact answer is, that's unfair to the modelers, okay? And then you take into account that many of those models use carbon taxes as a proxy for how you're gonna do that, but a carbon tax might be an efficient tool, but a carbon tax tells you nothing about how you're actually gonna solve all of the gazillions, just made up a word there, of real world problems that you are going to run into. So everything from the infant industry, how you get from the innovation stage and the first pilot to first of a kind to commercialization at scale, that all normally takes a lot of time. We are all seeking to compress that time very quickly. We will move down those learning by doing curves much faster, but the models don't assume these faster paces of learning by doing curves because that would seem irresponsible because it's not based on past practice. So I think we really need to unpack that in those assumptions. So whenever you are looking at that in the news or you're hearing a policymaker tell you some information, you need to ask a lot of questions about that. So that is think one. And I will say we've been doing a lot of work on that, and I have seen a lot of work that, internally that we've done that shows that these assumptions that we make on learning by doing and on the pace of the investment actually has huge implications for the GDP impacts, huge. So we need, and I know that you all have great teams here working on that. And the second thing that I wanted to comment on is on this 5 years and the short term, long term. So one of the things that we have focused on, I noted that we have 910 billion of announced investments. That means nothing because it's not actually shovels in the ground. It's not actually money being spent. It's announcements. But you go from announcements to actual money being spent, which we are tracking through the Bureau of Economic Analysis, government entity. That money, when it is spent on that investment, it typically takes 6 to 8 quarters for that money to show up in new manufacturing jobs. Okay, so to your point on confidence, that means that those manufacturing jobs, they are not likely to start until sometime this fall or winter. And that's the first tranche. And then you've got a few years of this, right? This all takes time. And 5 years is not, that is just not a lot of time to see the kinds of outcomes. So what we need to also be thinking about are, as we're doing all of this, we need to slow down and think about what are appropriate metrics of success at the scale of which the investment and the policy is happening. What are reasonable crowding in assumptions? And we've seen time and again in the US case over the past few years, forecasters have greatly underestimated the economic outcomes that we would see. I think some of this has to do with new challenges in modeling. And some of it is, you have to slow down and think about what is it that we're doing differently? And what are we trying to, and what speed and what are reasonable metrics of success? That has been a challenge we've run into, but I think that gets to some of these short-term, long-term questions. And then just briefly on the tech readiness, I do think that the New Deal should be a part of your growth metric. So that's just my own personal, I have no stake in this. That's not my fight, but I just want to comment on that. But on the early tech versus late, if anyone wants to follow up with me afterwards, we have made investments along each phase of that pipeline and different kinds of investments. So grants and loans, changes in reg, hubs for everything. It's a huge country of all these different technology hubs, workforce hubs, hydrogen hubs, different, trying to create that local work. And that may not cost a lot of money, but it creates that connective tissue in places that need that investment. What we've put on the table is that if you are a place in America and you want investment to come to your place, there are a lot of tools that we put in the table that you can then start to tap into. So you're also giving, and I love the way, Mariana, you talk about the agency of places, right? That people need to have a stake in it. And so when my colleague and I, we've been traveling the country, seeing how this is playing out in real places, you see those communities coming together. So anything you can do to foster that with the limited resources you have, but the federal government can create that connective tissue, creating that opportunity for those investments for communities to take advantage of what resources there are. And again, it's all about the private sector. Crowd it in, yeah.
Torsten, I'm going to come to you. I'm going to ask you to pick up one question I think you'll find very nice, which is the regional investment gap. You can talk about Swansea, I'm sure. And then one that you won't find as nice, which is the 5-year and the fiscal rules that Labour are currently proposing, and whether they give enough freedom for Labour to make the investments they need to make.
I mean, you can ask whatever you want. I'm not a Lib Dem, but it's a liberal country. Look, so let's do those in turn. So at one level, the answer is obviously just like yes, if you want to see productivity growth in our large cities, not just in the north, but in the Midlands too. And I would argue in Swansea, even though on a much smaller scale, then that is going to require more investment. Some of that should come from national government, but some of it also should probably be raised locally, and that would be a change from our current system. Now, just to raise that up a level, I think another way to think about this, and that should go something to Mariana was saying just a second ago on the sector list. Everyone always thinks about industrial strategies as, here's a list of sectors, we either are or would like to be quite good at them, and the sectors have asked for these 4 things, and they can have 3 of them. Right? I'm being a bit unfair, but that's like a summary. Generally, but particularly for a country like the UK that has the comparative advantages it has, it makes much more sense to think about an industrial strategy as a place-based strategy. Yes. How do you ensure that more places are set up to work in such a way that, given the nature of modern economies, they will be able to carry out higher value-added activity. That's the better way to think about it. That then requires you, it doesn't get you out of difficult decisions, you then got to get into capital allocation to allow the transport side of that will be necessary, where is the skills mix, and all the rest. You know, as I say, in Swansea we all have basically non-existent public transport, and we'll spend our time lobbying for a metro for exactly that, for that reason. But we have lots of skills, and lots of those are underutilised because there's a lack of office space, so other kinds of investments are also necessary. But basically, that's a long way of saying you're right, sir. On the fiscal rules, I mean, one, wait for the budget, everybody. Did you know there was a budget? Wait for the budget. Secondly, slightly more constructively, Rachel has already set out changes to the fiscal rules, not to the debt rule, which is another one that everyone is excited about, but to the borrowing rule, and so we're not having that. So the Tories' fiscal rule, which was we're going to target overall levels of borrowing that lumps all of current investment spending together, she's already said that's gone. Right? We're having a current budget rule that will just make sure that we're covering our day-to-day spending out of our tax revenue. So there's already movements in that direction. I would also say, I mean, I've obviously read the OBR paper and written about it. It's telling you two things. One, just be really clear what it's telling you. It's not telling you if you invest today, all the returns are only in the very long term. It's specifically telling you that if you raise the level of public investment and hold it there, the peak returns from that are very long way away. Right? It's a flow into a stock thing. Okay, that is what it's telling you about. That is a really important, but that's a different thing to when do the returns from the initial investments, which Heather's just told you happen in kind of more like 2-3 years cycle. So don't go into don't go too hair shirt about it. You haven't got to wait 50 years, like for the returns for being higher investment. And if you tell people that, well, did I mention the politics to you at the beginning? Fill the potholes in now. It will make a difference to the politics tomorrow. And then invest in your transport systems and others, and it will make a difference, and in your manufacturing plants and your office space, and that will make a difference on a shorter timescale. So don't get too gloomy, you big gloomster.
Gloomster.
Mariana, do you want to pick up on this question about the blockers in the kind of investment cycle, and particularly trying to commercialise and get some of these things out that we need in the economy?
And there was also the conditionality question.
Yeah, if you want to pick that one up,
Yeah, maybe I'll start with that one. So the word conditionality, again, sounds very strong. It sounds like there's a stick, but it's really just about reciprocity, right? How do we build ecosystems that are not parasitic, but mutualistic and symbiotic, right? Economists like to use words like public-private partnership or ecosystems, but they don't define the ecosystem. A biologist would ask you, is it a predator-prey ecosystem? Is it parasitic or not? So we need to build much more mutualistic, symbiotic ones. And to do that, we, again, need to look at the contracts, the kind of give and take. And it's just really obvious, but we don't do it. And I do think it's not just about confidence. There's legal issues that I mentioned. If you look at the law firms behind, whether it's Pfizer or other companies that create problematic deals for the public actors, we need to kind of put that more out in the open. So in the United States, the National Institutes of Health, every single year recently have been putting in $40 billion of direct investment in pharmaceutical innovation. The prices don't reflect that, and the intellectual property rights don't reflect that. There's nothing wrong with patents, but when they're too wide, they're too strong, they're too upstream, that's the wrong deal, right? The government has given a 17-year monopoly to the private sector. What does the government get back? Well, more diffusion once the patent is up, but if in the meantime those patents are abused, which they are, just gave you kind of the 3 ways that, just really quickly, they're abused, then that's a bad deal. Another example, water rights. Water in almost every country except Chile is owned by the state. When Pepsi-Cola or Anheuser-Busch use that water, there should be a deal. And yet 80% of industrial wastewater is not recycled, right? I mean, I could just go on. And so, of course we can do that here. And again, look at our water, what has happened to water in this country in terms of sewages. That's also a very bad deal in terms of how we negotiated a sell-off, if you want, of public infrastructure to the private sector. And it's not about privatization or nationalization, it's what was the deal. Again, the railways, why does Germany have fast, accessible, so lower price, sustainable trains? That's part of actually their industrial strategy. There's all sorts of different conditionality that then produces that. So I do think that this whole issue, it's not just, though, about contracts. It's also, if you go back to procurement, which itself is a contract, if we think of school meals, and I hate talking about Marcus Rashford because I'm an Arsenal supporter, so talking about anyone who's a Manchester United player is a problem, but he did a great service to this country, elevating again how important it was to produce school meals during COVID, so on and so forth. But imagine if we took something as normal as lunch and made it into an innovative target by saying that those school meals have to be healthy, tasty, and sustainable. That's what Sweden did. Why did Sweden do it? Because their challenge, again, goals, missions, challenges, and so on, their challenge is a fossil-free welfare state, and then they land it on the everyday, even lunch, which is the biggest restaurant chain in the world, which means that the procurement of those healthy, tasty, not just IKEA meatballs, sustainable lunches they require innovation in the supply chain. They require a different type of relationship between public and private. They require investment, innovation, training. So normalizing even what we mean by innovation, the whole innovation budget in this country is 10 billion. Just the procurement budget of the Ministry of Transport, Department of Transport here is 40 billion. So if all of a sudden we had a sustainable mobility strategy and used at least partly that procurement budget to do that, we've just massively increased our innovation budget. On the innovation chain, kind of the question of medtech, I wrote a book called The Entrepreneurial State back in 2013, precisely to kind of debunk, I'd say, some myths, which I think I sort of heard, we have to disagree a bit here, by Simon. It's not that public funding should just be for frontier research. Had we done that, we wouldn't have Silicon Valley. What the US decentralized networked state did, which I call the entrepreneurial state, they actually had a hand, not a heavy hand, but a very strategic hand across the whole innovation chain. There was upstream basic research, there was more downstream applied research, there was patient long-term finance for the Death Valley phase, which is not just 3 years, it's often 10 years. InQtel, one of the biggest public venture capital funds in the world, is in the CIA. Yasma is the one in Israel that many people talk about. So the patient long-term finance that those companies need, and even further downstream procurement, which ends up becoming, through the SBIR program in the US, where about 5% of each government budget has to be used for procuring in innovative solutions from SMEs. That's about getting startups to scale up. We just obsess here about startups, but they end up being just kind of irrelevant little companies that die unless they can scale. How can they scale through demand-side policies? The reason that Denmark today is the #1 provider of high-tech green digital services to China is actually because Copenhagen wanted to be the greenest city, and all these startups that were kind of there but not doing much, and working a bit with Vestas, their kind of big national champion, ended up becoming really innovative drivers of digital services around the green strategy of the city. And that's why, again, I always say it has to be cross-sectoral, digital as part of a green transition. So I think getting just kind of admitting that a big problem here is also that the innovation system might be strong in some bits, but is quite weak in other bits. So catapult centers, which were modeled around the Fraunhofers, spend 10 times less than the Fraunhofers on these science industry linkages. So to have this investment-led, innovation-driven goal or mission-oriented economy, we also have to look at that kind of decentralized network of institutions. And frankly, either they just don't exist, or the ones that do exist think they can just kind of hand out pennies instead of looking at even per capita, the similar kind of spends that we have in other parts of the world.
Thanks, Mariana. Simon.
Well, I think the great thing about accelerating the energy transition is that it can create jobs and investment right around the country. I mean, that's part of the fantastic thing about what we're trying to do here. So Ed Miliband's just signed off 10 gigawatts of new renewables contracts. Well, next year's auction puts some more conditionality in it into those contracts. So I'm a great believer in that. I mean, Marianne, I hate to, we seem to be agreeing too much here. Yeah. So all I'm saying is I don't think it's good value for money to invest in existing offshore wind farms, for example, because that's a waste of government money. That's not catalyzing anything. We're going to need interventions right across all the TRL levels. But my point is really, I think we can be much more ambitious than the 3-to-1 ratio that Rachel Reeves is talking about. I think actually, if you get it right, you can get much higher ratios than that. And my final point, as a former bureaucrat, I'm all in favor of the kind of changing the fiscal rules to treat investment different from current spending. But just be careful on the definitions. Otherwise, every public servant will be gaming those definitions. So be really, really tight on them, because I used to have a big budget in government, and you'd easily try and reinterpret those rules. So just need a tight definition of what is investment.
Yeah.
Great. I'm going to take a rapid round. We've got 10, 15 minutes. And then, lady on the left just here in the green/yellow coat. Just here. I'm not sure. Shout, maybe.
Angela Francis from WWF. Really pleased to hear everybody mention net zero as one of the missions, and Marianne mentioning biodiversity and water as well as these enormous global challenges, which we're going to have to address in industry. I'd really be interested to think about, we've talked a lot about the national return, but these are global challenges and we need a global return, and we want the technology leaps that are made to be ones that go around the globe. We need to do all the stuff we've outlined. I'm a massive supporter, but I have in my head the complaint from the Caribbean and bits of Mexico that said we were about to build a manufacturing plant and it relocated to Texas. How do we do good industrial transition that doesn't get the backs of everybody in the global south up, such that they see this as, you know, not a game they get to play in and another stitch up by the global north, and therefore, you know, net zero and biodiversity challenges are compounded and not seen as, you know, part of a global mission.
Okay, great. I'm going to take a couple more. The lady just behind.
Hi, thanks for an amazing panel. This is really fascinating. I'm Rachel Solomon-Williams from the Aldersgate Group. My mind is now blown about what we actually think an industrial strategy is. So I've heard about, on this panel, home energy efficiency, water, energy infrastructure, hospitals, schools. We've now heard about nature, high value, high GVA, new technologies, and also Simon's point about defining what we actually mean by investment. If we're defining a new industrial strategy, where are the edges of that? And which, you know, where is it just paying for public goods? Is that investment? Or is that just paying for public goods? And if we're trying to catalyse private investment, how do we categorise that? At the moment, I feel like we've talked about two different sorts of thing in one conversation.
Great. The lady in the white jacket on the far left.
Here you talk about the fact that 90% of the world runs water in public ownership. I'm Kat Hobbs from We Own It. And also to talk about the reservoirs not being built under privatisation. Right now, Thames Water is collapsing. The government has the special administration legal powers to take it into public ownership. The shareholders have already said the company is worth nothing. And the creditors are expecting a substantial write-down of the debt. So there's never been a cheaper time to take Thames Water into public ownership and to build on the best practice that we see in places like Paris, where they have households and water experts on the governing boards of these water companies. That's normal in other countries. What does the panel think about taking this opportunity to take back Thames Water? Because the government's excuse at the moment about the cost of water nationalisation is actually been said to be economically illiterate by Dieter Helm, based on an out-of-date Social Market Foundation report that actually is completely inaccurate. And if you look at the work of Dieter Helm, that's clear. And in the case of Thames Water, obviously, it's in dire straits, and now would be the time.
Thank you for your question. We're going to take one more. The lady in the green, just here.
Thank you. Sarah Williams from Social Housing Magazine. I'd just be interested to get the panel's views on what a sector being classed as infrastructure does for the ability to attract private investment. On a lot of the housing panels, affordable housing panels I've been on today, there's been talk about how it would be good if that could be termed as social infrastructure or just infrastructure to invest, to attract more investment.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm going to ask panellists to pick one question because we've got 10 minutes. So if you pick the one question that you want to take, I'm going to come to you first, Carson.
Great. I think I'll pick the question on, what is industrial strategy? And Heather will probably have lots more to say on this, but the way it differs from traditional, say, public investment is that it takes into account the complementarities between sectors. You're seeing that, say, growing the heat pump industry in the UK is not just a matter of doing one little policy lever, but for example, you might also want to create demand alongside creating the industry. And it's perhaps not just one industry, but you also need to unlock the skills bottlenecks that prevent people from working in this heat pump industry. And it also interrelates with what you import in terms of heat pumps. And I think this also gets to the question of what do you get in terms of returns to this investment? Traditionally, the Treasury with their Green Book, and even today, largely, they just look at it project by project, and they don't take into account these complementarities, this all-government approach, a type of policy and the returns you get for it. So I think it can be applied to a lot of different policy areas, but it should also be applied to the way we think about the returns we get from investment, because if you design it right with an all-government approach, you can get much bigger returns. I think that's partly what we're learning from other countries that have taken this approach.
Heather?
Yeah, so I'm going to take the global one, but it really is about the industrial strategy and how you define it in some ways as well. And I mean, the word that comes to mind when we're thinking about this is agglomeration. Like, how do we think about what we're creating, what kinds of supply chains, what kinds of local ecosystems around these technologies? But I do want to be clear, in our case in the U.S., we've been very clear that it's a specific set of industries that we have defined around our modern American industrial strategy. So semiconductors and those cutting-edge technologies, clean energy. We also put care on the agenda, but that didn't get across the finish line yet. It remains a top priority. But I think clean energy really is it is a unique case, because the whole world, to your question on global, we all know that we all need these technologies, and we need them produced massively at scale at a price point that people can afford. So there is analysis by a U.S. firm called Rhodium that shows that every ton of carbon pollution reduced in the United States because of the IRA would lead to 2.9 tons reduced elsewhere because of the investment and how that's going to push down the cost curve. So we often have thought that we do have the resources to make these investments. We have made investments at the beginning of that innovation to commercialization chain on many of these new clean energy technologies. What can we do to get those to commercialization at scale so that they can be disseminated? So that's one side of that question. Of course, the other side is, how do we think about this in terms of global supply chains and trade? How do we think about the work with the multilateral banks and the investment community globally to make sure that we are creating that opportunity? I always start that answer with the simple fact that we need to be investing far more globally than we are today in many multitudes. And there are many technologies that are not yet at scale. This is a moment. Maybe it's a unique moment, or maybe we've never seen them, like maybe we weren't looking for them before, but there's a lot of opportunity to bring countries in to these new clean energy supply chains, and that's what the United States has been prioritizing. So at COP28, Vice President Harris launched the Clean Energy Supply Chain Collaborative. There's a $568 million Treasury Clean Tech Fund to help spur this, really finding ways to bring countries along, and thinking about how we can make sure to further position producers both at home and abroad to thrive in a race to the top. And so what do we need to do to our trade rules, to the way that we think about building out a new set of supply chains? We have an opportunity to get this right. And so that is what my colleagues in the White House and around the agencies have been really trying to focus on.
Austin?
Your question's an excellent one. I think we should distinguish between the things where there are clearly widespread goods from us making an effort. Okay, so the technology we require to deliver the net zero transition, the developed world investing in that has benefits that will hopefully spread right around the world. In fact, in Britain's case, that, as much as decarbonising ourselves, is our contribution, having obviously created large chunks of the problem in the past. So that's the easy one on your question. The harder one from today's politics is when you get to the manufacturing of some of the actual products involved. I think that's a completely reasonable challenge. You'll see that eventually with heat pumps. You'll probably see it with middle income countries, not the very poorest when it comes to cars. And that's a reasonable question to ask, and that's where domestic politics and international strains happen. So yes, it's tough. Yeah, that's a good thing. Life is tough. On social housing, on the question, I just wouldn't bother with faffing around with the language, right? That's not the barrier to social housing investment today. The barrier to social housing investment is the amount of public funds, the level of interest rates, the balance sheets of some of our housing associations, and obviously our councils. Right, that being, I was with the 3 chief execs. We've got 3 decent-sized housing associations in Swansea last week. None of them are asking me questions about what's the word that we're using to describe it. And I see that all the time in terms of people saying, oh, if only we redefine investment as this or that or the other. I mean, a bit, but if half as much effort went into the actual hard yards of like getting stuff done as went into that. I think that makes sense if you've got to write a policy paper, and I say that as someone who's written a lot of policy papers. That's not a good use of your life energy.
Thanks, Toby. Very, very direct. Mariana, which one are you going to go?
Yeah, well, someone's got to answer the Thames Water case, but I wanted to talk about the global governance issue just because I'm currently co-chairing with Vera Songway the G20 expert group on climate and finance, and the report's coming out, so I shouldn't say what's in it, but anyway, it's divided into 3 sections: green global industrial strategy, green global finance, and then the explicit global governance of this, so justice and equity is at the center. Because the critique has been, and I'm not sure if you completely answered it, you might want to come back in, that something like the IRA, great for the US, and it has, not intentionally, but potentially as a side effect, created a capital flight of green capital from Africa to the US. And if it was complemented by exactly the policies you say, so perhaps that's already the answer, technology transfer policies, patent pool policies, which actually haven't really happened, then one could counter that. But it doesn't happen on its own, and these things are fought for. I mean, look at COVID, right? What was the mission? It wasn't just to create 8 vaccines, it was to vaccinate the world. Because it's a global pandemic. It doesn't make any sense just to vaccinate, one country or one neighborhood. And yet we didn't produce the vaccines with that goal in mind. And so it had equity and justice around global solidarity, not just sending expired vaccines later from the global north to the global south, but producing them in such a way with equity and justice at the center. Then it would have been more of the AstraZeneca type vaccine, where it was the Oxford University researchers who did care about that global mission and insisted that on that particular vaccine, prices and costs remain low, and the patent pool sharing of the knowledge. But most of the other vaccines didn't do that. And that's why I do think it's really important for us to go away from just public-private partnerships. Where can we learn where a good partnership had a goal that had justice and equity at the center, and how did that then force the innovation system, the collective intelligence, the collaboration between different actors to be of a specific type? And by the way, when you do that, it actually requires even more innovation, right? Because it requires you to get out of the status quo and your kind of lazy ways of working. And that's why I also think, just on the question of industrial strategy, is this too wide? Well, no. In a country, let's just be really honest, and I don't hear the CBI talking about this enough, or Aldersgate Group, where you have similar to what my friend in Brazil, who used to run the big Brazilian public bank, used to say that Brazil is capitalism without capitalists. You don't have enough investment in this country, and forget the complaints about tax and planning and regulations. Of course, we need to get that right. But you also have a system where we're allowing profits to get generated without the investment because of that kind of financialized Carillion, Thames Water type of corporate governance. Then of course an industrial strategy should be one that gets all sectors to actually invest. And it's different from just talking about kind of public goods, but there's lots of sectors, I almost can't think of any in the UK that could use a bit of a shake-up, and there's no better way to do that with really clear public goals that then at the center of that, again, without rehearsing what I already said, has that kind of conditionality, whether it's food, health, or transport. They're all critical, but many of these are not investing.
Thank you. Last word, Simon, over to you.
Well, I won't comment on whether water should be renationalised. That's not my place. But I will say this, that regulatory frameworks in the UK were largely put in place post-privatisation, and they operate on a 5-year timescale. We now need to shift that timescale and shift that approach to generating the investment we're going to need, the infrastructure that we're going to need for the future. So there is a big shift there, irrespective of the ownership question.
Well, thank you, everyone. I think we can safely claim this was the wonkiest panel at Labour Party conference.
Speak for yourself.
With the wonkiest panellists. So thank you, everyone, for joining us, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Exactly.